Hello, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. We call ourselves FOLCS, and welcome to the FOLCS Conversation series. Tonight, our special guest, Bari Weiss, author, journalist, activist, and really longtime friend of Thane's. And I'm very proud to call her my friend. She's a courageous, intellectually honest voice in our increasingly toxic cancellation culture. And she's the author of this incredibly, relatively new book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, which we'll talk about today. But it's a book that's more than just about anti-Semitism. It's really about this political moment in time. And in fact, to back that up, just today, or was it last night, there's a new Bari Weiss essay that came out in Tablet magazine that we'll make available to you in the chat box. That speaks about the very points that come out in How to Fight Anti-Semitism with respect to the decline of liberal culture and what progressives and liberals should be thinking about, because there are changes coming and they've already arrived. And of course, the book itself, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, among other things, sets up sort of three different phases of modern anti-Semitism: extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing, and radical Islam. And it calls attention to the double standards and hypocrisy of anti-Semitism that's oftentimes disguised as a human rights issue. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, and I know that audience continues to grow every time we do a FOLCS conversation, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Like us on Facebook while you're there. And why don't you go back on folks.org at some point and give us your email address, because that way it won't be random finding us on Facebook. We'll send you advance notice of our upcoming events. We encourage you to buy Bari's book. There's a link for Bari's book in the chat box. You can always go find it there. And that link for that essay that I just told you about, Bari's most recent essay dealing with liberal culture and the decline of liberal culture, that is there as well. Please read that. And ladies and gentlemen, Bari Weiss. So Bari, hey, thanks for doing this.
Hi, Thane. It's really nice to see you.
Yeah, I wish I could hug you, but this is the next best thing. So Bari, you know, as a author, journalist, activist, as a journalist, normally your job is to cover newsworthy events. It's very rare when the journalist becomes newsworthy. You, my friend, have become an event as of late. Your departure from the New York Times, and so we're going to spend some time talking about that. I was thinking about how, you know, when journalists are depicted in feature films, right? All the President's Men, you know, The Killing Fields, you know, the Sidney Schanberg story about the Cambodia, right? And even Spotlight most recently. It's interesting. It's always heroic journalists seeking the truth, uncovering the truth. In the Bari Weiss movie, I haven't quite cast it yet, but it's
Rachel Weisz. Okay, let's punch up.
Right. That's right.
I can reach for the stars.
Well, it's also, she doesn't have to remember her last name. It'll be very close if it's Rachel. All she has to do is have an American accent,
Exactly.
a Pittsburgh accent, actually.
A girl can dream.
Yeah, all right. Well, I was going to give you Rachel McAdams, but I think you're right. Rachel Weisz would be good too. So that's an interesting story, because there's the journalist that is seeking the truth and calling attention to journalism itself not doing its job. That's a very different twist. It's a commentary about the job of journalism when journalism fails to tell its truth. Can you just, as briefly as you can, it's not possible, we have a lot of people watching today. My guest, Bari, is everyone knows the circumstances recently of your departure, but you have penned what I would now call the most famous resignation letter in the history of journalism. Tell our audience briefly sort of the circumstances that led up to the Tom Cotton op-ed and your leaving the Times.
Sure. So I'll do it sort of on one foot, and Thane, you'll tell me if I've left something important out. But I would say this. For those who don't know me, I had worked for years at the Wall Street Journal editorial page as an op-ed editor and writer, and then as a book review editor. And I was always the leftmost flank at a conservative editorial page. So I was used to being politically homeless, politically uncomfortable. I have a pretty thick skin, as Thane can attest. After the nomination and the eventual election of Donald Trump in 2016, I was a never Trump person, and I felt increasingly out of step at the Journal. So I was looking for new work, and the Times was also going through a period of soul searching. They, like many other publications in the country, had confirmation bias and had missed this enormous, seismic, world transforming, arguably, story. And so in the aftermath of that, there was soul searching. There was a sense of, we need to do better by our readers by exposing them to more of the spectrum of opinion that exists in America, because clearly we were sort of constrained to the viewpoints of Brooklyn and the Upper West Side. So myself and Brett Stevens, and there were others, were brought on to do just that. My job description was to, write things that would, provoke the average Times reader, certainly provoked my other colleagues, and then also to be a commissioning editor, to bring in voices and pieces that would not otherwise appear in the New York Times. These were conservatives, these were heterodox folks, my expertise at the time was dissidents throughout the Arab world, and I loved that work. And it was incredibly meaningful for me to do it. From the beginning, I was never going to be at the cool kids table at the New York Times. There were people giving me the cold shoulder, people wouldn't speak to me, all people listening in on my conversations, like not professional behavior. But all of that was kind of worth the price, as you guys can imagine, of being at the most powerful newspaper in the world. What changed really, and the reason that I am talking to you now as a journalist, a newspaper woman without a newspaper, is what changed is the New York Times. It went from, like this sense in 2016 of, we need to resist tribalism, we need to listen to Americans that disagree with us, to what you have now, which is a much more hardened viewpoint. It is sort of the shift from what I think of as the old school liberal idea of journalism, pursuing the news without fear or favor, striving for objectivity, even as we all know our own fallibility and subjectivity, but holding that up as a paragon of what we should be striving for, to what you have now, which is something, one journalist has called it moral clarity. It's really a kind of journalism that's more in the pursuit of a particular set of causes, honestly, and stories that don't fit that narrative can now get a writer under, at the very least, incredibly scrutinized, or in the case of the Tom Cotton op-ed, fired. So I'm sure people on the call remember this, but in early June, we ran an op-ed from Republican Senator Tom Cotton expressing a view that was then held by the majority of Americans. I haven't seen the polling since then, but at the time it was something like 62%. And the op-ed was calling for bringing in the National Guard to put down rioting. It was not calling to put down peaceful protests, which was one of the sort of disinformation things that grew out of that. Now, in the old world of the New York Times 10 years ago, an op-ed like that wouldn't be cause for news even, but in this case, it was cause for a kind of staff revolt. 800 people signed a petition saying that this op-ed put the lives of Black Americans, and specifically Black New York Times editors, in danger. One of my bosses was demoted, and the other one was pushed out of the paper. This was a watershed moment, because all of a sudden you have a New York Times in which the view of a sitting Republican senator is far outside of the Overton window.
That represents the majority view of Americans.
Right.
Right. On top of that.
But inside the culture of the New York Times, what that view represented was beyond the pale kind of fascist adjacency, if you can call it that. So that, I'll say two more things. That made the work that I wanted to do and I was hired to do impossible. One of the things that was not in my letter is that in the aftermath of that op-ed running, we changed our whole editing system to where every single editor and trust me, I know this sounds crazy, had to sign off and say that they were comfortable with every single op-ed. Well, that made my job impossible because I was explicitly supposed to bring in op-eds that made people uncomfortable. And I was told that I should no longer commission op-eds for the paper, which was a huge part of my job. And then, and this is something that I imagine anyone that's been in a deeply religious environment can understand. The environment became one just increasingly sort of homogenous in its thinking. And in an environment of sort of true belief, true religious belief, or true political belief in this case, people that don't go along with every single aspect of the program, and this is what we talk about when we talk about cancel culture, become something like heretics. And so I was treated that way. There were axe emojis put next to my name inside company-wide Slacks. There would be, meetings of the entire company where people would talk about when I would ask the editor-in-chief and the publisher of the paper when I was going to be fired. And just to reiterate, I had nothing to do with this op-ed. So that was the kind of atmosphere. And I had a really hard choice to make because anyone who's worked at the New York Times or a similarly, gilded place can tell you that there is sort of nothing more powerful than saying you are Bari Weiss of the New York Times. Having that as your last name is incredibly powerful, not just in the ego sense of telling people you work there, but in getting people to call you back as a journalist. And so giving up that post and that prestige was a really hard decision for me. But I ultimately felt like we are at such a hinge moment in this country. And the reasons I went into journalism were to tell the truth about the world. And I just felt like I was gonna have to become a half version of myself in order to maintain the benefit or the prestige of working there. And I felt like ultimately in life, there are things more important than that. And one of the things that's more important than that for me is being able to be my whole self and tell the truth. But maybe one of the things when I talk about Thane and take this wherever you want to go is that the Times is only one data point in a much broader
Yes, we are definitely
revolution.
Yeah, no, I actually think that it's an exhibit of many exhibits, and that many ways we should not just speaking about this as only a phenomenon within the New York Times. I would argue that it's largely a phenomenon within the broader culture, certainly within publishing, certainly within journalism, that this is not an uncommon. I thought what you described was beyond anything any of us could have imagined. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I think you're quite right, that we should think of this as an attack on liberal culture, an attack on liberalism, and a failure of an institution that we used to depend on about giving us news, as opposed to what you've described in your letter, which is, as in what you said tonight, moral clarity, as if teaching us morals, as if what the job of the New York Times is to convince all of us that we are seeing things wrong, and this is the way it needs to be seen. This is the correct way of seeing things in the world of the politics of identity, wokeness, intersectionality, and we'll get to that in a second too. So you penned what I would call, an astonishingly thoughtful but revealing resignation letter. In my mind, I don't want to exaggerate, it was so watershed, Bari. I mean, to me, it had the profound feeling of like, Emile Zola during the Dreyfus affair, J'accuse. It had that. I know you would be embarrassed, but I think we will look back on this day and say that letter reminded us of something that was coming. And by the way, your essay that just appeared today was a further reminder. So that's why I'm telling our FOLCS audience to don't forget to read the essay. So let me just ask you a few questions about the resignation. The first question is, does this mean that at some point you think the New York Times, did they make a consolidated decision that, you know what, we were flat-footed in 2016. We didn't really understand red states. We didn't really understand conservative America. We didn't really understand what the word deplorable means. Like, we just didn't know that it's a really bad word and that word is not something that could be casually dismissed. And so that we have to bring in some people like Bari and Brett and others to help us cover the news better. Are you saying that somehow that mission got hijacked and it got forgotten? Like, why did they lose their commitment? Because I thought, frankly, as you know, Bari, as one of your close friends, with Brett, I thought, wow, this is a really great sign. The New
Yeah.
York Times, my
Yeah.
God, brought in a team of experts here.
I think what you're seeing, to put it bluntly, is the power of, well, it's really economics at the end of the day. The New York Times is a business, right? And just to go back about 2 decades before the advent of the thing that we are talking to each other through, the thing that the entity that the New York Times had to worry about pissing off were its advertisers. That's obviously no longer the case. The people that, in the end of the day, the New York Times answers to are its readers. And more than 90% of New York Times readers identify as liberals and Democrats. So I think what you are seeing, and I see this now more clearly now that I'm out of it, is the kind of MSNBC-ification of the paper of record. And I think within the coming few years, the branding that is so powerful, that the New York Times still holds up, the truth is hard, the truth is powerful, the truth requires sacrifice, that's going to ring as increasingly hollow. But look at the New York Times stock price. People really love it. Just like as Fox viewers really love watching Tucker Carlson, and Rachel Maddow people really love Rachel Maddow. It's, in a way, we're going back to like journalism in the time of Ben Franklin. You know, it's like, it's going to be, I think, a much more balkanized.
Balkanized, yeah.
And in a way, if you look at Europe, what you had was something like the New York Times was an exception, right? The press there is all sort of more explicit in its political bent. I think the thing that's frustrating is the gap between now what the New York Times claims to be and what it obviously is. And the logo and the font are still the same, but the paper has changed. And I think one of the most obvious examples of that is, you know, the full-throated defense on the part of the masthead of the 1619 Project, you know, right, which was stealth edited, and which knowingly published historical inaccuracies over the strident objections of a fact checker who went with those objections to Politico. If that fell squarely within the standards of the New York Times, and if that, as the editor-in-chief said the other day, if that project fills him with pride, that tells you something about where the paper is. It tells you something when we run, or when, sorry, not we, when the New York Times runs an op-ed by, you know, a Chinese, when it runs Chinese Communist Party propaganda as an op-ed, and there's no staff anger over that, at least publicly. Don't tell anyone that tells you to disbelieve your lying eyes. That's kind of my message. Right. And that has to do with the Times, but it also has to do with the transformation of so many other institutions that have long sort of upheld liberal culture and the liberal order. And the New York Times is a very important pillar of that, but it's only one. We're seeing this in publishing houses, in museums, increasingly in corporate America, certainly in our universities. And that's why I think this is such an important story.
I see. So in your letter, you actually talk about how Twitter is not on the masthead of, I think you said, of the New York Times, but it is essentially a silent editor. Yes. So when you say, you know, it's not just the subscribers, I was going to ask you something else. I was thrown by when you said, hey, Thane, you know, 90% of the subscribers love what the Times is doing. But in the letter, you also mentioned Twitter. And I always wonder, I go, do the people, why does Twitter have this kind of influence that it could have brought such changes to the paper of record, and that Bari Weiss would leave and say that Twitter actually functions as a silent editor in this process? I'm thinking, how many Twitter subscribers are they even subscribers?
That's a great distinction. So I would say, at least right now, the average subscriber to the New York Times is definitely 50 plus, maybe even 60 plus.
You mean the age group?
Age group.
Right.
Doesn't really know much about what's been called the successor ideology, or the illiberal challenge to liberalism, or what some people call wokeness or social justice. They know they're progressive. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this dynamic is, I feel in a certain way like the paper is kind of radicalizing a lot of its subscribers, which is a project that I didn't really want to be part of. The Twitter thing that you raise, and I think this is really significant, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's going to be a reader revolt and say, you know, why aren't you telling us more about, I don't know, what's going on with the hijacking of K through 12 education to this ideology? You never read a story on that in the New York Times. And maybe that will be the case as people sort of live their lives and see the gap between what they know to be true and what's reported in the paper. I hope that's the case. But one of the things I'm seeing, like, never underestimate the power of a dinner party. Most journalists want to be accepted by their friends. They're living in a liberal milieu, and Twitter only heightens that sense because everything is recorded for forever. So, you know, why would you want to make your life more difficult by running a story that's going to run afoul of this ideology, piss off your friends, make you the skunk at the garden party, and get you a lot of misery and hate on the internet? There's just every pressure point pushes in the opposite direction toward, let's just run another op-ed about how Donald Trump is obscene, and obviously he is.
And in that way, Twitter has a role on that. That's where they exert disproportionate influence.
Yes, but I'm saying it's very hard. Like, journalists are human beings. Institutions are people. I mean, if anything has brought that home, it's been the Trump administration, right? So just apply that same logic that institutions are only as strong as the people upholding their values. And it's very easy to understand how we are where we are.
So you mentioned here, and it certainly comes across in the resignation letter. By the way, is the resignation letter still available online?
Yeah, it's on my website.
Okay, because I think it's worth reading. I'm telling the audience it's baryweiss.com, right?
Yeah, I'll share the link in the chat right now.
Okay, but you did describe a kind of Mean Girls 2 kind of environment, which was for me, very difficult to read as your friend, frankly. Let me ask you this. You mentioned in the letter that some of the comments on Slack had something to do with Jewish being some of the stories that you commissioned, op-eds, essays, having a sort of Jewish or Israel sensibility. I'm just curious, since we're going to get into talking about anti-Semitism, if you were not Jewish, but you took the exact same positions and played the same role that you played and commissioned the same op-eds and wrote your own columns in the same way and spoke out openly in the way that you spoke, but were not Jewish, would it have been any different?
It's impossible to separate the two because I write so much about Jewish topics and about Israel. Mm-hmm. I will say that, there's a lot of Jews that work at the New York Times, obviously. So maybe it seems strange that I was sort of called out in that way. I think the way for people to understand it and to understand this, again, more broadly, like this is emblematic of a much bigger story. It's not about me, is those Jews who essentially I'm going to put it in stark language for people, who essentially convert into non-Zionism, anti-Zionism, and fully subscribe to what's colloquially called wokeness, but the social justice ideology. They're acceptable. And that, of course, for anyone who on here has Jewish students in college or in certain high schools even now, you will understand that bargain because it's the one that's being put to an increasing number of Jewish kids on campus life.
You're saying kids know this. They understand this, that this is a club they can join, and by doing so, life will be better on campus.
It's more subtle than that for many people, but yes. I mean, yes. And of course it's true, because if you go to a campus, which is obviously overwhelmingly progressive, why would you want to not do the thing that would allow you to have a fun social life and be accepted and all of the rest? And so, one of the things that's really difficult about this dynamic is that, there are a number of Jews who essentially act as a kind of shield, in a way, of this movement. And that's really, really difficult.
That they play this role. You just reminded me of something, Bari. I think you wrote, or you told me once, that you were surprised that, and by the way, as you know, Bari, I've lived this life in academia until I moved to Truro. This was my day every day. And when I ever told people on the outside that no one believed me. Right? They literally thought I was lying. So
why didn't they believe you? I'm curious.
NY Jew?
Yeah.
They would literally say NY. I mean, I have to say people literally thought I was making stuff up. NY Jew? How can that be? New York? So I'm just saying, I lived this life for many, many years. But I think you said, I think you told me or I read, and I agreed with this, if this is what you said, that I was shocked that what I was experiencing on campus had moved, gravitated
Yes.
to the public sphere outside of campuses. Like I always assume, all right, my life is miserable, but at least it won't be miserable for people once they graduate and they go off into the world. So what you're describing is something else. You're saying, no, Thane, it actually migrated out of campus life. First of all, were you surprised by that? And how did it do that? How did it accomplish that?
Okay, so the long march is something that used to be a punchline, but it's actually reality. I mean, this began, we don't have time to go into like the sort of perpetuation of postmodernism and post-colonialism and critical race theory, but suffice it to say that like in the late 60s, this sort of mixture of ideologies took hold in a lot of campuses, or really that was its nucleation point. And I would say for certainly when I was on campus 15 years ago at Columbia, there was this sense among, both Republicans and Democrats, liberals as well as conservatives, that, what happened on campuses was a fun punchline and good clickbait. But essentially, both agreed that it was a kind of tempest in a teapot. And as your, gender studies major at Vassar or Oberlin or whatever made her way into a job at McKinsey, that the ideologies that she'd been marinating, the politics of campus, would be left behind. That has just proven to not be the case. It turns out that ideas actually matter. And people that have been marinating really in what is now the dominant ideology at many of our elite campuses, rather than the institutions that they were moving into shaping them, they have transformed the institutions. I cannot say this more strongly enough. This is everywhere. Okay, it's obviously not, maybe in a car dealership in Tennessee. That's true for people that are skeptical of that. But inside all of the institutions where, liberals like me work, live, interact, buy from, sell to, whatever, this is the dominant ideology. And the problem with it is that it calls itself progressive, but it is deeply illiberal. And I just can't emphasize enough how widespread it is and how it fundamentally undermines the tenets of liberalism that have, in my view, made this country so exceptional. It's not just, by the way, about revisiting, let's say, something like the American founding, which is an interesting historical project. It's about challenging the ideas of the Enlightenment itself. And I don't want to live in a world.
Pluralism, equal justice under the law, the basic fundamental principles of enlightened governance, right?
Exactly. It basically says those are the master's tools because they were designed by dead white men, and the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So, sorry, the phone's ringing. This is not my house. So that's a real problem, because without conversation, without free speech, without these tools that have been, in my view, the greatest tools for progress in all of human history, what are we left with? We're left with what we're beginning to live through, and I fear is going to get worse, which is a kind of dehumanization, polarization, tribalism, and increasing normalization of violence and
a dogma that must be accepted.
Oh,
right?
yes.
I mean, just an absolute dogma. What you've already described, right? Life is easier if you just buy into these premises. And if I say things about how I feel privileged because I'm white, and who am I to speak? I have to defer. All the things that the catechisms that one would need to say to be accepted. That there's a true sense of dogma that you're saying has pervaded not just universities but all institutions.
Yes, and I would say that it's a little bit like, for those who are familiar, the greengrocer in Havel's famous essay, who puts up the Workers of the World Unite sign in the window, even though he doesn't believe it, because you know what? He has a mortgage and kids and he just wants to get along. I think a lot of what we're seeing is that, and the only way that I see it changing is people starting to stand up. People understanding that words that are very uncool right now, words like duty and responsibility, moral obligation, that those things matter and those things make a difference. And I feel very, very obligated, honestly. And I can't sit here and lie to you. Like, I've lost friends. It's definitely made my life, as Thane, I'm sure you can imagine, more difficult. But in the end of the day, like, if I can't stand up for the truth, who am I, really?
So I'm going to ask one more question before we get into the book and specific anti-Semitism. I hate to ask this question because you're a never Trumper, but if anybody's listening to the last 25 minutes of Bari Weiss, one could say, so is there fake news? Should we, when we hear this, maybe we should not think about it as something that Donald Trump is talking about, but that we should all be a little guarded and suspicious because we're describing something that is, as she pointed out from the very beginning, something the papers want you to know, that it's very important for you to know this in order to be a good person, and that's, to them, supersedes all other values, including journalistic values. Well, that is a much more sophisticated, nuanced way of saying fake news. Should we be worried?
I mean, of course we should be worried. I left the New York Times to sort of blow the whistle on that fear. It's a really hard question, though, because I desperately want there to be a world where you have something like a New York Times that you can trust. That's what I imagine spending the next 5-10 years of my life doing, is building that kind of journalistic enterprise. And so one of the things I, resent Donald Trump for is the way that he has diminished trust in so many of our public institutions. But I don't think you can be honest and not acknowledge the role that the institutions themselves have had, the hand that they've had in doing that too. But what I try and do in my own news consumption is just read a lot. I read the Wall Street Journal and I still read the Times. Some of the greatest journalists in the world still work there. And certainly our China coverage, for example, I mean, it's unparalleled. Yeah. But I also try and I think this is going to be increasingly true. I spend a lot of time in what I think of as the Wild West. That's the world of podcasts, newsletters like Andrew Sullivan and Matt Taibbi's, following certain Twitter accounts. That's a good solution for someone like me, who's, an elder millennial who lives online. For people like my parents, that's not a good solution. We need a common address for healthy, independent-minded journalism. And that's what I see as sort of being the next stage of what I do.
So speaking of your parents, this is a nice little segue. I happen to know them. They're lovely, the Weisses. Talk about the Tree of Life Synagogue, because what many of our viewers probably know, but some may not. I mean, you were always famous to me, but people really started to know who you were literally 24 hours after the gunman killed synagogue worshipers in your hometown at the very synagogue that you had your bat mitzvah. And in the book, you talk about, worrying that your father was there on that day and communicating with your 3 sisters to find out where your father was. And then just it so happens, I mean, it's an amazing story, Bari, that all of a sudden you are the New York Times person who knows more about that synagogue than anybody. And naturally, you were the one to write the essay. And the next week you were on Bill Maher. And all of a sudden, everyone who knows who you are. It really was a transformative moment. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because it's linked to you from forever now.
Yeah, I will say, by the way, that one of the most gratifying experiences of that week was getting to see the way that, it was specifically Jenny Medina, getting to see the way that reporters do what they do. And I feel like I've been a little harsh on the Times. I stand by everything I said, but I also want to inject that, again, like the level of professionalism and grit and dedication of so many people there kind of blew my mind. And And that was one of the things I got to do that week. What's the right way to talk about this? I mean, in a way, it changed everything for me. I grew up, and it sounds strange, right? Because I am someone who has always led with my Jewish identity. It's been at the forefront of who I've been for my entire life. I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. I grew up in a politically mixed home. My dad is a Trump-curious conservative. My mom is a liberal who withheld sex during the last election, is doing that again to make sure he would vote for Trump. So we were always talking about ideas, and it was like we lived literally in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. He lived down the street from Tree of Life. We lived half a mile away. The important thing to understand about my family is that we were always talking about politics and ideas and history, especially when it came to Jewish topics. And so, I was in high school during the Second Intifada. I went to Israel for the year in 2002, the outbreak of the Iraq War. I was extremely aware of the anti-Semitism that buffeted Jews in other times and in other places. I could tell you about how Ilan Halimi was murdered in Paris. I could tell you who was killed in the Sabaros bombing, who was killed in Cafe Moment. I knew all of that. It's just, I had been raised in such and it's beautiful in a way, in such a strong mythology about what America was and why the ideas that this country was based on were directly correlated with why we were the luckiest diaspora Jews in history. And that was the ideology that I grew up in. I didn't even know it had a name because it touched everything. And so when anti-Semitic things happened to me when I was a kid, like, a Catholic school bus driving by, when my sister and I were waiting at our bus stop and screaming at us kikes and dirty Jews, or people telling me to pick up pennies, it all just rolled off my back. Like, I saw all of that as an embarrassment of those people, because they were sort of somehow out of step with what America was really about. And I think that faith, if I can call it that, was really, really shaken on the morning of October 27th. And then 6 months later to the day Poway. And then what we've been seeing, sort of the rolling attacks going on against the most visible Jews in places like Crown Heights and Borough Park. And then the kind of institutionalized anti-Semitism that we're seeing under the guise of social justice or criticism of Israel. All of that has combined to make me feel, like the guy that screamed kike and dirty Jews at me when he was 11 or 12 years old, maybe 13, that view has become much more normalized and is sort of no longer a fringe position. That's much more in the mainstream. So that's one thing that's worried me. The sense that we have just lived through a presidency with, whatever you think about any number of his policies, some of which I agree with, you can't deny that his sort of character and behavior has done what, our friend Brett Stevens has called, dismantling the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down, normalizing things that should be taboo. And, the way that I put it in the book is that in retrospect, I had spent my life on a holiday from history. My friend Danny Gordis likes to say that Americans are people that think history happens to other people. And I think that that's especially true of the Jews. And there were lots of good reasons that we were sort of lulled. Like, we lived in Joseph's years of plenty. That was America after the mid-century. And, and now all of a sudden we're realizing that, maybe if the ideas that have protected us are under sustained assault, then that will have downstream effects on us.
But the book is so fascinating in ways because you are very upfront in sort of diagnosing the situation and say, hey guys, there's really three heads to this. There's a far right wing, which we can say is what happened in Pittsburgh at your hometown synagogue. But the first 25 minutes of our talk today was really about the extreme left wing, right? What's at universities. The subject of your essay that's in Tablet is really about the left wing.
Yep.
The decimation of liberal values that you and I have been banding about, left wing. In the book, you say, look, this was a transformative moment. There's this lovely anecdote in the book that I got weepy, frankly, at when you described that how the community around, Squirrel Hill, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Even the Pittsburgh Steelers showed up, that this was such a sign of solidarity. Steelers, players, coaches, Muslims, people from the community showed up to the synagogue. And so that was something that was extraordinarily a hopeful, out of a tragedy, that something like that, which we never heard during Kristallnacht, in Austria and Germany. No, the community did not rush to the synagogues that were burning. It didn't happen like that. So, but I'm wondering though, you do say in the book that for all of the violence that you have a great line, you said, the odds are that if a guy's carrying a gun and into a synagogue, he's on the right wing, right? That's a right-wing violence. He's not on the left wing. But I think you also believe that the numbers are on the left side, left wing. The danger to democracy is more on the liberal side. The danger to Jews, because they themselves feel ambivalence about where they belong, because they want to belong on the left into the progressive circles, the compromises that you so eloquently mention. I don't know if we'll have time, but there's a lovely passage that I was going to read about why Jews do what they do to sign up to this, because similar to what you said.
I'd love it. I don't know which one you're thinking of.
Oh, can I just do that? I want to do this. It's just
Sure.
so lovely. It's, let's see if I can find this.
I'll just add one thing while you look it
Yeah.
up, which is one of the reasons that I get accused of this a lot, as you can imagine. I am mostly surrounded by, live in a liberal world, is that, if I encounter white supremacists in my life, it's with them bullying me on the internet or sending me death threats. Those aren't the people that I have dinner with. That's, and also there's moral clarity, to use the word we talked about before, when it comes to someone that says all Jews must die or kill all the Jews, which is what the Pittsburgh killer said.
But you're saying the more subtle, the left. Well, let me read this to you. You say, this is what you say. This is just so lovely. You say, this is just a perfect paragraph. Very few of these people fear literal violence. What these Jews dread is something more intimate and more likely. And this is the point, is that they're not worried on the left. They're not worried about, submachine guns. They're not worried about bomb threats. They're worried about what you say here. What these Jews dread is something more intimate and more likely. Moral condemnation, social ostracism, and reputational vilification meted out by peers, professors, friends, and political allies. To be a good progressive increasingly requires distorting Jewish history and disavowing the Jewish state. Telling the truth is not worth the risk to reputations, careers, or social standing. Bari, that is a ridiculously great paragraph and very powerful. But that does raise this question. The tree of life was transformative, but it does seem where the direction you're headed, both in the book and in your future, just in the essay that you just wrote, is really not on the right, it's on the left. And that I think you're most worried about that.
I'm worried about both. I mean, certainly in terms of my own physical safety, which is something that I have to worry about now. I'm definitely still worried about that. And the reason that there's metal detectors in every JCC, that's real. That's very, very real.
You're saying that's not coming from being shunned by a professor. That's not why those metal detectors are there.
Right. Most of the people that I'm, write about in that paragraph, that threat, they might have tenure, but they don't have a gun, And so don't mistake it. I am absolutely scared of the right and let's say of the far right. And, I think the most maybe dangerous thing coming from the far right now is QAnon. And, a conspiracy theory that talks about a elite and the Democratic elite that conspires to drink the blood of children and traffic in, pedophilia. That's one step away from being about Jews. So I'm very worried about that. But I want to be honest. And that ideology, yes, I think there's someone named Marjorie Greene who ascribes to it, who's running for public office. But that ideology and white supremacist views, they do not control or have carry any water inside of the institutions that actually shape the culture. And, and I, that's just the truth. So that gets me a lot of flack, as you can imagine. Like, maybe it means that I am sympathetic to Trump and I am taking my eye off the prize. And to that, I just say, like, not everything needs to be about the bad orange man. There are other things in the world. You can dislike Trump and also be very worried about the power of big tech, or very worried about, the rise of China, or very worried about this. And I just reject the kind of zero-sum mentality that I feel like has characterized a lot of the past few years.
So one of the points you make in the book, the very important point, is that on this issue of left-wing anti-Semitism and the complexity there is for Jews themselves on where they belong, is the explaining away of prejudice, to ignore it. You call it a conspiracy of silence, excusing the prejudice and the violence and the anti-Semitism, minimizing it, explaining it away, sometimes even speaking of it as justified payback. You make that point, saying that there's all ways to excuse when violence is happening. By the way, we saw a lot of this in the Black Lives Matter, the offshoots, the violence that came out of it. There was a lot of rush to explain it in some other context. You point out in the book, and I love that you mentioned that, in Europe, when acts of violence were committed by Muslims, especially both in the UK and in Germany, especially in this era of the Syrian refugee crisis, the press didn't want to cover that. They just didn't want to mention it. It was just very, it would become, again, not about the truth. And I think many members of the public felt betrayed that the story was not being covered. Here we've seen examples even recently. Tamika Mallory, one of the founders of the Women's March, her embracing Louis Farrakhan. Congress, you talk about Congress Ilhan Omar, and it's all about the Benjamins baby, or things that no one was willing to call out, to stand up for. Everyone was prepared to excuse it, explain it away, and minimize it, trivialize it. One of the things you point out, and I'd like you to speak to this, is that the compromise that's being asked of liberals in order to play in the arena of the progressive field, that this is part of the catechism. That one can, again, you can call out Steve King or any right-wing candidate, but you can't call out a woman of color who has anti-Semitic tendencies. This is an ongoing problem that, Bari, I don't think you think is going away.
No, and I think that, there was a really useful example the other day that, to me, didn't come as a surprise at all, but a lot of people I know were shocked by it. And that was when AOC pulled out of an Americans for Peace Now event for the 25th anniversary of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. And everyone was shocked, like, surely she just doesn't know, it must be a mistake. We just need to
the great Israeli peacemaker. How does she not?
Right. But of course it wasn't a mistake. It was a reading of the room, and the sense that she doesn't need to go to that event because, she's making a judgment about who should be part of the progressive coalition and who shouldn't. And I think it's instructive, and people should take that as a signal and a harbinger. And the fact that, days later she, put up a bunch of an Instagram post, and it was also on Twitter, of her wearing a Black Panther shirt and sort of as an apologia for the Black Panthers. And don't close your eyes to that. And I would say to people on this call, don't hurt your future self for the sake of your present one. Like, it's never going to be easy. And in fact, it's only going to get harder. And I think that there's a little bit too much of that going on right now.
So, yeah, the anecdote that I can't get out of my head is the one that also dealt with the Women's March, which was that apparently I think there were 3 or 4 founders of the original Women's March. One would be Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, and 2 Jewish women whose names, sadly, I can't remember right now. But the anecdote that I can't forget, and you know where I'm going, is after this successful march, and now the question is, what do we do next, right? In what direction do we take this movement? I think that the two Jewish co-founders were surprised to learn that the other founders did not see them as equals when it came to leadership positions. And they thought that if this is a progressive movement, Jewish women don't have a role to play because Jews were involved in the slave trade, and they were really spoken to. They were given a browbeating. And I think the two Jewish women were shocked that this was what they were being told, that we are almost being kicked out of the movement because we don't qualify. We are white privileged women, and we are being told that we have been oppressors, both of Palestinians and of, you know, Africans who came to the United States through the slave trade. And I think that that to me was a giant wake-up call, because they essentially, Bari, left the movement, right? They left the movement.
But again, yes. And I again, like, I just think this is very emblematic of something I've been thinking about for a while, which is, you know, it's like in this ideology, victimhood or perceived victimhood confers morality and status and authority. And it's almost like I think, therefore I am, replaced with I am, therefore I know, or I am, therefore I am right. And that is just very, very dangerous, no matter what direction it cuts in. I just simply reject any ideology that says that someone, by dint of their birth or by dint of their skin color or by dint of their genitalia or gender identity, somehow has more claim to truth than someone else. That to me is just very, very retrograde ideas being repackaged to us in progressive language, and I just reject it.
Well, you know, I hope you'll remember the essay that you just wrote, because I'm not remembering it as well as I wish I did. But please, the audience, please read this, because you mentioned this point several times in the essay. And one of the things that you say is things that we're now being told can't be said or done, standards that we can't exert because the standards themselves are a sign of oppression. Do you remember some of those anecdotes? Because they're very powerful.
Sure. I mean, the one that really sticks with me, because I've been following this charter school movement for years. I'm sure people on this call will know the KIPP charter schools, and they famously had a slogan, work hard, be nice, work hard. And they took away work hard because work hard is sort of evidence of white supremacist framing. The Smithsonian Institution, people remember this summer, put out a frame for how to think about race, and it talked about how politeness, hard work, the nuclear family, even reason, were evidence of white supremacist thinking. There's a woman on the school board in San Francisco today tweeting about how merit is evidence of white supremacy. I mean, if you buy into an ideology in which any inequality of outcome between groups is evidence of racism, then all of a sudden you are forced to call a lot of things racism, a lot. And I think it's just very dangerous. It's wrong. And I think it's ultimately quite racist.
Yeah, you make that point in the essay. And again, I encourage our viewers to read it, because I was remembering as you were talking that you had a great run-up of a number of these anecdotes that I think are somewhat shocking in this new book that I have out. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I would challenge people to understand things like the efforts to get rid of the SAT, or the efforts to get rid of the admissions test to schools like Stuyvesant and Lowell, which for decades have been the engines of the meritocracy, allowing poor and working class kids to get a chance. Or the argument that the classical music critic of the Times made recently to get rid of blind auditions for orchestras. I mean, like, I don't know. Are those things racist? I don't think so.
Yeah,
I certainly don't think the overwhelming, I think it's 65% of kids at Stuyvesant are Asian American. You know, are they white supremacists? Because I just you sort of lose the plot at a certain point.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. And my recent book on First Amendment, I tell some anecdotes. One that I was found shocking is at the University of California system, the chancellor sent out a memo of phrases that he thinks could be considered trigger warnings or microaggressions. And one was Merry Christmas. And I went, that's a joke. And the other one is America is a democracy. That these words themselves, to say America is a democracy, is offensive. And the other thing is, and you point this out in a number of different occasions, is, and I saw this in your resignation letter, because it's something that I revere the 1960 civil rights workers, the African Americans, the Jews, the liberals that went down for Freedom Summer. So when I see words like you described earlier in our talk, where you said the protest by the 900 New York Times staffers, that the running of an op-ed from a United States senator talking about invoking the possibility of bringing out the military to quell violence, that 62% of Americans would agree with, endangers the lives of African Americans at the New York Times. It just feels like that trivializes what happened to Medgar Evers. It trivializes what happened to the three civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. I just don't think it's the same thing. I don't think that the language that we're seeing on the university of how these things that we don't want to hear somehow also put our lives in jeopardy is something that I just have had a lot of trouble with. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you have an ideology that at once claims that speech is violence, but looting is not violence if it's done by the right people against the wrong people.
Yeah.
You judge for yourself if that's an ideology that makes sense.
So, but what are we supposed to do? I love how you started off by saying, hey, Thane, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I wasn't conservative. I was there for a different reason. Wherever I go, I'm there for a different reason. I went to the New York Times, and all of a sudden, I was considered the conservative one.
But I'm always there for the same reason. It's just,
right.
I haven't changed, I don't think.
Right.
I'm sure, I hope actually in certain ways I've changed and gotten smarter and changed my mind. Certainly have on certain.
But you're saying the answering the call, the reason you're there has been the same, right? You haven't changed your commitment to the truth.
Trust me, if I wanted to make a lot more money and have an easier life, I would leave journalism, especially in this moment.
Right.
But I just, I was always raised on the idea that, in the marketplace ideas, the best ideas win. I don't think that anymore. The best ideas don't necessarily win. The fittest ideas can win. Propaganda can often win if the circumstances are right. The ideas win when they are defended. And right now, a lot of people, and I think the reason we're seeing this is that people got too complacent, that those ideas were just self-evident. And I think we're really living through a moment where they need to be defended in a really full-throated way.
But what about the unsolvable things, right? You're Bari Weiss, so I'm going right to the tough stuff. We know that you're an ever-Trumper. We know one of the reasons you are, and you remind us in your book, is you believe in treating immigrants like remembering the biblical invocation, Jews should know that we were once strangers in Egypt, and so that we should be kind to strangers. In your book, you point out, I had forgotten, in the Bible, we understand that Abraham's tent was a place that people were invited to, Abraham's tent. Bari Weiss grows up in Pittsburgh, and she understands that that is what it means to be a Jew. And President Trump's denunciations of immigrants has been on many levels for you offensive. And you are someone who I'm sure believes providing a safe haven for Syrian refugees traveling through Europe. But we also have this other unsolvable problem, which is that it's not clear whether the Muslims of Europe are able to fully assimilate into European culture. And we're living in this woke universe that isn't asking them to. We have no-go zones in Paris. And so we have this incredible conflict, as you point out in the book. The violence committed against Jews, beginning with Ilan Halimi outside of Paris, against Jews in Europe, here you're right when you say, if you're a Jew in a synagogue and someone comes in with a gun, he's probably right-wing. But that's not true. In Europe, as you point out, the odds are very high. He's a Muslim who doesn't have a job, who's disaffected and just comes with prejudices from the Middle East and brings it to Europe and says, that's a Jew and therefore he's my enemy. And you pointed out something that was fascinating. You said statistically in Europe, if a crime is committed against a Jew and they don't know exactly who did it, they automatically call it right-wing violence because they don't want to, again, embarrass Muslims. What about this other unsolvable problem that we have, you know, a difficulty of people embracing the very liberal values that you say are under attack?
God, well, I see that we're at, like, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer this in the
I'm going to
time.
take a couple questions from the audience after this and then say goodnight to you.
Okay. Listen, this is a topic that we could talk for an hour about this. I would simply recommend Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe, on this, and say that, you know, I myself really hated writing that chapter. I wanted to weasel my way out of it because it felt so painful to think, you know, when I think about the Syrian refugee problem, although now that feels so far away, obviously it's still ongoing. I think about, you know, I forget his first name, Kurdi, the boy in the red t-shirt that we all knew his name, who washed up on the beaches of Turkey. And I see like my ancestors in that child. And I also, you know, again, I feel obligated to tell the hard truths, which is that bad ideas don't get checked at a border, nor do they get checked to bring it full circle to the beginning of this conversation between the college campus and increasingly the rest of the country. And so in a way, it's the same problem. And it all sort of comes back to how do we create a culture where certain ideas are dominant and protected? And I don't think we have an answer to that right now.
All right, we're going to take one question from the audience and we'll say goodnight to Bari. This is from, are you ready, Bari? Yeah. You'll be impressed with the reach of FOLCS. My board is going to love this. This comes to us from Ji Hee Jung. He's watching from Korea.
Hi.
So this is from Ji Hee. He says, before resigning from the Times, were you contemplating whether your power to change and steer the paper in the right direction would be somehow lost if you left, right? In what way did you jeopardize the project by leaving if Bari Weiss leaves?
Who asked me that? G?
Yeah, G. Mm-hmm.
That was the whole thing. You hit the nail on the head. I felt so torn about this. But this had really been going on for a long time without getting into too many details. Behind the scenes of me sending countless emails and memos and just spending a lot of my time trying to do exactly that, trying to right the ship. Maybe I left too early. Time will tell. But I ultimately made the calculation that I couldn't move it enough in the right direction. I couldn't do my work that I was put here to do. And I ultimately made that decision. Now, someone in a different case with a place maybe less, more easily reformable, stay in that place. Like, I do think that reform, when it's possible, is the best case solution, because guess what? It is really freaking hard to build new institutions, as I'm now figuring out. But also trust yourself, right? Like you can't, like if you're encountering the same thing and doing the same thing over and over and over again for a few years, you kind of have your message and your answer. And I think Thane knows that well. So yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, these are the kind of emails I get from people every day, advice on what to do, better to leap, better to stay inside and try and make it better. And each case is really, really different. I'm pretty confident though that I made the right one.
All right, before we say goodnight to Bari, we've got some closing remarks, upcoming events. Shervin, where are we? We got that coming up. We have an event on, oh, there it is. We have a conversation on immigration, which is a perfect lead-in from what Bari and I were just talking about. Immigration, the pandemic, and the election. We have 3 experts on the United States law dealing with immigration matters, how things have changed during the Trump administration, and what we're likely to see, how the pandemic has affected the immigration crisis, And so if you're, and also you can get CLE credit from that. So we hope to see you for that. That's on October 27th. And of course, yes, we are a non-for-profit, folks.org, donate. You can also text. As you know, during the pandemic, we haven't charged, and we have no intention of doing so. We think we're providing a public service. I have no doubt that everybody on today's program believes they are now a better, smarter person that they heard Bari Weiss for the last hour. That was just remarkable. Bari, my dear, loving friend, I admire you. I adore you.
Thank
Please
you.
know that your brave voice is essential. It's singular. So girlfriend, keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much.
Good night from folks. Thane Rosenbaum. See you next time. Good night, Bari. Love you.
Take care. Bye.